Have you ever noticed how quickly everything slips through your fingers? A beautiful sunset fades into darkness. The warmth of laughter dissolves into silence. The person you thought would stay forever walks away. And what once felt certain begins to unravel without warning. Yet, even as life constantly changes around us, there's a stubborn part of the human heart that refuses to believe it. We chase after security, cling to comfort, and hold tightly to what we love as if it could last forever. Deep down, we know it won't, but we pretend it might. It's one of the great illusions of the human experience, the illusion of permanence. From the moment we take our first breath, we enter a world built on shifting sands. Nothing here stands still. The seasons change, our bodies age, fortunes rise and fall, relationships bloom and wither. Even the cells in your body, the very skin you wear, die and renew themselves in a ceaseless cycle. But despite this, we live as though we can capture and hold on to each fleeting thing. It isn't foolishness, it's instinct. A natural yearning for stability in a world that promises none. A desperate need for something solid to grasp when everything feels like it's slipping away. And so, we build our lives on attachments, to people, to possessions, to identities, to stories about who we think we are, and what we believe we need to be happy. We tell ourselves that if we can just hold on tight enough, if we work hard enough, if we make the right choices, then maybe, just maybe, we can keep the things that matter most from leaving us. But life, indifferent and unstoppable, moves on anyway. The Buddha saw this clearly over 2,500 years ago. He recognized that behind every ache in the human heart, every quiet sorrow, and every restless night, is this very craving for permanence in an impermanent world. And it was this simple, undeniable truth that formed the foundation of his teaching. He called it anicca, impermanence, not as a poetic idea, not as an abstract philosophy, but as an unavoidable reality woven into the fabric of existence itself. Nothing remains as it was. Everything flows, everything changes. The trees outside your window, the emotions you feel right now, the person listening to this voice. All of it is moving, transforming and dissolving in ways too subtle for the ordinary eye to catch. And the deeper tragedy isn't the change itself, it's our resistance to it. We suffer not because life is impermanent, but because we wish it were. We cling to what is bound to pass. We grieve what was never meant to stay. We resist what is always arriving. In moments of clarity, you felt it too. Those times when something you loved slipped away and you realized you were powerless to stop it. A job lost, a relationship ending, a beloved pet growing old. The final goodbye to someone who meant everything. It's in those moments that the truth pierces through our illusions like lightning through the dark. Nothing we cling to can be held. And it hurts. But here's the part no one ever told us. Within that realization is the seed of profound freedom. For if nothing can be held, then nothing can truly imprison us. If everything is a flow, then we are not bound by the weight of yesterday or the anxieties of tomorrow. We are in every moment new, alive, untethered. The river does not mourn the passing of each drop of water. The sky does not grieve the disappearance of a cloud. And we too can learn to exist within this flowing current of life, not as desperate clingers, but as graceful witnesses experiencing fully, releasing gently, and moving onward without resistance. There's a quiet power in knowing that you don't have to hold on, that you can cherish something deeply while it's here and let it go when it's time without collapsing under the weight of loss. It isn't indifference, it's wisdom. A wisdom born not of cold detachment, but of intimate understanding. This wisdom has echoed through Buddhist teachings for centuries, reminding us that liberation isn't found in control, but in letting go of the illusion that control was ever possible. And the journey toward that freedom begins not with grand gestures, but with subtle shifts in how we see the world. It starts by noticing the small ways we grasp at life, by watching how we react when plans fall through, when someone disappoints us, when things don't go our way. Each of those moments is a tiny doorway, an invitation to loosen our grip, to trust the flow, to remember that we are not here to possess life but to experience it. And so, as you listen to these words, perhaps you'll sense it too, that steady, quiet current moving through all things, the breath rising and falling in your chest, the sound of this voice fading and returning like waves against the shore, the silent passing of this very moment, already gone as soon as it arrives. If you can feel that, even for an instant, you've begun the journey. A journey not toward escape or avoidance, but toward a deeper, richer way of living. One where we love without fear, grieve without despair, and release without regret. The truth is, there's nothing to hold, and that is not a tragedy, it's a liberation. Now, let's follow this current a little deeper. If you sit by a river long enough, you'll notice something beautiful. The water is never the same. It rushes, it trickles, it slows, it roars, but it never stops. It carries fallen leaves, broken twigs, moments of sunlight dancing on its surface, and then it moves on. The river doesn't cling to the leaf, nor mourn the lost shimmer of light. It simply flows, and in many ways, life is no different. Everything from the rise and fall of nations to the gentle turning of your own heartbeat moves in a current too vast and mysterious to control. The breath you're taking right now was not the one before, and it won't be the one after. The cells in your body are in constant motion, dying and being born again and again, whether you notice or not. Your thoughts, your moods, the people you meet, the opportunities you chase, all of it is part of an endless, seamless flow. And yet, for most of us, we live as though life is a series of fixed points. We mark birthdays, anniversaries, job titles, possessions, and relationships as if they're monuments, forgetting that even stone wears away beneath the rain. We tell ourselves, this is who I am. This is where I belong. This is what makes me happy. But the moment those words leave our lips, the current has already shifted. It's a quiet paradox. We crave stability in a world designed for movement. Buddhism, perhaps more than any other spiritual tradition, confronts this head-on, not as something to fear, but as something to understand, to embrace. The Buddha didn't teach impermanence as a punishment or a cruel twist of fate. He revealed it as the essential nature of reality, a truth as reliable as gravity, as constant as the changing of the seasons. In ancient Pali, it's called anicca, the endless arising and passing of all conditioned things. Not some esoteric concept for monks in distant temples, but a living truth playing out in the smallest details of your daily life. The morning cup of tea grows cold. The laughter of a child softens into memory. The sting of heartbreak fades. A grudge you swore you'd hold forever quietly dissolves one ordinary afternoon. Everything flows, and within that flow lies both the cause of our suffering and the key to our freedom. Because here's the secret. It isn't impermanence that breaks our hearts, it's our refusal to move with it. When we cling to what's meant to pass, when we resist what's meant to arrive, we stand in defiance of the very current that carries all things. And in that resistance, we drown. But the river isn't the enemy. The flow of life isn't a threat. It only becomes painful when we try to anchor ourselves to something that cannot stay. Imagine holding a fistful of water, desperately trying to keep it from escaping. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. And the frustration you feel doesn't come from the water's nature. It comes from your unwillingness to let it be what it is. This is how most of us move through the world, grasping, clinging, demanding that what we love should remain and what we fear should disappear. And when life, as it always does, ignores our demands, we suffer. The Buddha compared this to a man struck by an arrow. The first arrow is life itself, the inevitable pains, losses, and changes that come with being human. The second arrow is our reaction to it, the anger, denial, and resistance we hurl back at reality. We may not have control over the first arrow, but we can choose whether to fire the second. And when we stop fighting the flow, something extraordinary happens. We begin to see beauty where we once saw loss. We discover that the fleeting nature of a moment doesn't make it less valuable. It makes it precious. A flower that blooms for a single day is no less magnificent than one that lasts for weeks. In fact, it might be more so, precisely because it is rare and temporary. When we accept the ever-changing nature of all things, life stops being a battle and becomes a dance. We stop trying to freeze the river and instead learn how to float. It's not about detachment in the cold, indifferent sense. It's about engaging with life so fully, so presently, that we can let each moment pass without clinging or fear. We can love deeply, knowing nothing lasts. We can grieve honestly, knowing even sorrow moves on. And we can meet each new experience not with dread but with open hands, because everything is a flow. And to resist it is to miss the miracle of being alive within it. So the question isn't, how do I stop things from changing? It's, how do I move with the current instead of against it? How do I hold the people and moments I love lightly, cherishing them while they're here and letting them go when they must leave? How do I soften around disappointment, around uncertainty, around the aching ache of impermanence without becoming hardened or bitter? These are not small questions. They're the heart of what it means to be human. And though there are no instant answers, there is a path, a way of living, breathing, and seeing the world that turns even the most ordinary moment into a teaching, and every loss into a doorway toward greater wisdom. The river of life will carry us whether we like it or not. But if we can learn to trust it, to move within its current with a little more grace and a little less fear, then perhaps we might discover something astonishing. Not in escaping the flow, but in finally allowing ourselves to be part of it. And with that, let's keep floating forward. It's strange, isn't it? We know deep down that nothing stays, that people leave, seasons change, and time carries us whether we're ready or not. And yet, we hold on. We hold on to people, as if loving them fiercely enough will stop them from leaving. We grip tightly to memories, wishing we could crawl back inside them. We cling to identities, labels, stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we're supposed to be. And in that clinging, we suffer. It's one of the oldest stories in human history, the ache of wanting what can't stay, the quiet agony of resisting what already is. And though it wears 1,000 faces, it always comes back to the same source: our refusal to accept the flow. The Buddha called this dukkha, often translated as suffering, but it's not just pain in the physical sense. It's that gnawing discomfort, that dissatisfaction that lingers even in moments of joy. It's the unease that follows us like a shadow, even when life seems perfect. Because no matter how beautiful, how successful, or how deeply we love, there's always the knowing that it won't last. A sunset so breathtaking it makes you ache, gone within minutes. A relationship that once felt eternal slips away like sand through your fingers. A youth you thought would never end, reflected back to you in someone else's eyes. Dukkha isn't a punishment. It's a law of nature, a direct consequence of living in a world where everything moves. But here's the part we so often miss. It's not the impermanence that causes our suffering. It's our clinging to what cannot stay. It's like trying to trap smoke in your hands. The tighter you close your fingers, the more desperately you grasp, the quicker it escapes. and all you're left with is frustration and empty hands. The Buddha taught that craving, or tanha, is the root of this suffering. Not desire itself, it's natural to want warmth, connection, meaning. But when that desire hardens into attachment, when we convince ourselves we cannot be okay unless we possess or control something, suffering follows like a shadow. Think of it, when you fall in love with someone, it's beautiful. But if your happiness becomes dependent on their presence, on their behavior, on their never changing, the sweetness of love turns bitter. Because you're no longer loving them as they are, you're trying to freeze them in place. We do this with everything. With money, with beauty, with our reputations, even with our own bodies. And in every case, the outcome is the same: suffering. Because life was never designed to be static. It moves, it changes, and so must we, but our minds resist this. They whisper, if I could just hold on to this, if I could make this last, then I'd be safe. And it's understandable. We're wired for survival. We crave certainty, security, the illusion of control. Yet life offers none of those things. And the more we chase them, the more we trap ourselves in a cycle of craving and disappointment. It's like drinking salt water to quench your thirst. The more you consume, the more parched you become. So what's the alternative? If life is impermanent and clinging leads to suffering, do we withdraw? Do we stop loving, stop dreaming, stop reaching for beauty because it won't last? Not at all. In fact, it's the opposite. The wisdom lies in loving without clinging, in holding every experience, every relationship, every moment with open hands, to savor them fully while they're here, and to let them go when it's time. Imagine a child chasing butterflies in a field. The joy isn't in capturing them, it's in running, laughing, marveling at their colors as they flutter by. If you crush them in your hands to keep them, the magic dies. Life is no different. Freedom isn't found in escaping change, but in releasing our resistance to it, in softening the tight grip of our attachments, in recognizing that everything we love, everything we fear, and everything we are is part of an endless, unfolding flow. And when we move with it instead of against it, suffering begins to loosen its hold. This doesn't mean we stop feeling pain. It means pain no longer defines us. It becomes a passing wave on the surface of a vast, unshaken ocean. And this shift from clinging to allowing is not just a philosophical idea. It's a daily, intimate practice. It happens in small, quiet choices, in noticing the moment you start grasping at a thought or an expectation, in softening your reaction when life doesn't meet your script, in sitting with discomfort without rushing to fix it. And little by little, the tide begins to turn. The tight knots inside you loosen. The bitterness softens. And what's left is something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more enduring than the fleeting pleasures we once chased. A kind of peace that isn't dependent on things going our way. A resilience born not from controlling life, but from moving within it. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom, not to escape the world but to see it clearly, to live fully in its beauty and sorrow without being bound by either, to hold everything lightly, to bow to the impermanence of it all. And as we begin to understand this, not as an idea but as a lived experience, something remarkable happens. The very things we feared losing become more precious. Not because we can keep them, but because we know we can't. And in that knowing, we are free. The current carries us forward, and ahead lies something extraordinary. Have you ever wondered, who are you really? Not the name you were given, not the job title on your business card, not the face you see in the mirror, but you beneath all of it. It's a question that haunts us quietly. In the still moments when no one's watching, when the world falls silent and we're left alone with ourselves. Who is this I we speak of? This voice narrating our lives, this character we play in the grand story of existence. For centuries, Buddhist wisdom has offered a radical answer. There is no fixed, unchanging self. No solid, permanent I behind your thoughts, emotions, and memories. Instead, what you call yourself is a fluid, ever-shifting process. A collection of sensations, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. What the Buddha called the five aggregates. Like a river that seems continuous, yet is never made of the same water twice. You see, from moment to moment, everything about you changes. Your thoughts flicker and fade. Your emotions rise and fall like waves. Your body ages, cells dying and regenerating in an endless cycle. Even your memories, those precious fragments of who you believe you are, reshape themselves each time you recall them. And yet, we cling to the idea of a solid self as if it were the anchor holding our lives together. We say things like, "I've always been this way," or "This is just who I am." But if you look closely, you'll realize the person you were 5 years ago, 5 months ago, even 5 minutes ago is gone, replaced by someone new. The face in old photographs, the way you laughed, the people you loved, the fears that kept you up at night, so much has shifted. And yet, we insist on carrying this illusion of a fixed identity. Why? Because it feels safer. A self gives us a reference point, a narrative to cling to in the chaos of existence. It tells us who we are, what we should want, how we should act. It lets us believe we're in control. But as we explored before, control is a myth. And so is the unchanging self. The Buddha compared this illusion to a chariot. If you dismantle a chariot, wheel, axle, seat, reins, and lay the pieces on the ground, where is the chariot? Was it ever more than the sum of its parts? And when those parts shift, does the chariot remain the same? You are no different. The I you identify with is a temporary gathering of conditions. When those conditions change, as they always do, the self changes too. The danger comes when we refuse to see this. When we grip tightly to a fixed identity, we create suffering. If you believe I am a successful person, what happens when failure arrives? If your worth is tied to youth or beauty, what happens when time takes its toll? If you cling to a story of being a victim, a hero, a lover, a loner, you trap yourself in roles that no longer fit. The truth is, every identity you wear is a costume, useful for a time but never meant to be permanent. And here's the strange beauty in this. When you release the need to be someone, you gain the freedom to be anything. You're no longer confined by the labels you or others have placed upon you. You move with life instead of against it. You grieve without becoming grief. You succeed without becoming arrogance. You fail without becoming shame. Imagine what it would be like to live that way. To wake up each day not as the fixed, predictable character you've always played, but as an open field. To meet each moment fresh, untethered by the past, unafraid of what's next. This is not about erasing your history or denying your experiences. It's about recognizing that you are not the things that happen to you. You are the awareness in which they appear and disappear. Thoughts come and go. Emotions surge and settle. The roles you play shift with circumstances. But the consciousness observing it all, wordless, spacious, ungraspable, remains. And when you rest in that awareness, the desperate need to defend your identity, to cling to your story, begins to dissolve. The I softens. You begin to see yourself not as a solid rock, but as a wave in the ocean, unique in shape for a time, yet inseparable from the vastness around it. And in that realization comes an unexpected peace. The fear of change, the anxiety of impermanence loses its sharpness. Because you're no longer trying to preserve what was never meant to last. You love more freely. You grieve more honestly. You laugh more deeply. Not because you've figured life out, but because you've stopped insisting it makes sense. This is the invitation Buddhism extends. to see through the illusion of a fixed self, to realize the I you defend so fiercely is a story, a process, a beautiful, fleeting dance of conditions. And when you accept that not just with your mind but with your whole being, something remarkable happens. You stop drowning in the river, and you start flowing with it. And in that flow, something deeper awakens. There's a quiet kind of sorrow that lives in the human heart. It's not always loud. It doesn't always announce itself with tears or trembling hands. Sometimes, it's the subtle ache when something beautiful slips through your fingers. The tightening in your chest when you realize a moment you cherished is gone. Or the fear of losing what you hold dear before it even leaves. Buddha saw this. He saw the endless restlessness, the craving, the grasping. And he named it for what it was, attachment. At the very core of human suffering lies our desperate, unconscious urge to cling. We cling to people. We cling to possessions. We cling to identities, ideas, memories, outcomes. And in doing so, we chain ourselves to things that, by their very nature, cannot last. The Buddha taught, whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. Yet we live as though the people we love will stay forever. As though success, youth, health, or admiration will remain untouched by time. But life isn't built that way. Everything you love, everything you fear, every moment you treasure is already in motion. Already changing, shifting, dissolving. And when we refuse to accept this, we suffer. Think about it. The pain of heartbreak doesn't come just from the loss of a relationship. It comes from clinging to what it was, from the refusal to release it. The grief of aging isn't only in the body's changes. It's in the attachment to youth, the illusion of permanence. The stress of ambition isn't solely about striving. It's about clinging to an image of who you think you should be. And it happens in 1,000 subtle ways. When you check your phone for validation, when you chase praise or fear criticism, when you obsess over what was or anxiously grasp for what might be. This is attachment. And it's not limited to obvious things like wealth or relationships. We even cling to our suffering, to our wounds, our stories of betrayal, our identities as victims or heroes, because even pain can feel safer than the unknown. But here's the thing, what we cling to doesn't cling to us. Life moves forward, people leave, moments fade, things fall apart. And when our hands stay gripped around what's gone, it's not the world that hurts us, it's our refusal to let go. The Buddha described this like picking up a burning ember with the intention of throwing it at someone else. In the end, the one who gets burned is you. So why do we do it? Why do we cling so tightly, knowing it brings suffering? Because in attachment we seek security, a sense of control in a world that promises none, a false refuge from the inevitability of change. But it's a fragile shelter. The more you cling, the more life's natural flow feels like a threat. You resist what is. You fight what must come. And in that resistance, sorrow blooms. Yet, paradoxically, in the loosening of the grip, peace arises. Letting go doesn't mean apathy. It doesn't mean denying love or ambition or desire. It means loving fully while understanding its nature. It means striving for what matters while knowing its outcome is beyond your command. It means showing up for life with open hands, not clenched fists. When you release attachment, you don't lose your humanity, you reclaim it. Suddenly, joy is no longer dependent on conditions. You can savor beauty without fearing its departure. You can love people without trying to possess them. You can move through sorrow without it becoming your prison. This is what the Buddha called freedom. It's not freedom from emotions or relationships or the world. It's freedom from the need to control them. And you begin to see that sorrow itself isn't the enemy. It's the teacher, pointing you back again and again to the places you're still holding on. The heartache, the anxiety, the regret. They whisper, look here. This is where you're clinging. This is where you're trying to freeze the river. And when you listen not to judge but to understand, you can soften your grip. You can watch the ember fall from your hand and feel, perhaps for the first time in years, the coolness of release. This is not a one-time act. It's a practice. To notice where you're clinging, to gently loosen your grasp, to trust the flow. And in that practice, sorrow becomes less of a weight and more of a guide. It no longer drags you under. It teaches you how to swim. And soon, you'll find yourself afloat in the river of life, not because the current stopped, but because you stopped fighting it. And when you do, something unexpected happens. Where sorrow once lived, something softer begins to bloom. A tenderness, a clarity, a kind of love that isn't about owning or keeping, but about witnessing and cherishing what moves through your hands, knowing it was never meant to stay. And in that, you're no longer at war with the world. You're finally, beautifully at peace with it. There's a quiet art to letting go. Not the kind born from bitterness or indifference, but a release that feels like an exhale after holding your breath for far too long. We spend so much of our lives clutching tightly to people, to identities, to expectations, to moments we wish we could freeze in time. And with every grasp, we weave invisible chains around our hearts. But the truth is, life was never meant to be a possession. It was meant to be experienced. The Buddha called this path vimutti, the liberation of the heart. And its gateway is letting go. Not because you stop caring, but because you care enough to allow things to be what they are. Because you finally see that freedom isn't something granted by the world. It's something you reclaim when you no longer demand the world conform to your desires. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean erasing your past, or walking away from love, or silencing your hopes. It means loosening your grip on what you cannot control. It's the wisdom to recognize when you're holding onto a burning rope, mistaking pain for security. It's the courage to open your hands and let the ember fall. You begin to realize that the tighter you cling, the more life slips through your fingers. That in your effort to possess, you miss the very thing you're trying to hold. There's a story from the old Zen tradition. A monk and his disciple were traveling together when they came to a river. A young woman stood at the edge, afraid to cross. Without hesitation, the monk lifted her in his arms and carried her to the other side. Hours later, the disciple, still agitated, spoke up. "Master, as monks, we're forbidden to touch women. How could you carry her?" The old monk smiled gently. "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" And in those simple words, a profound truth unfolds. We carry so many things long after their time. Old wounds, unfinished arguments, moments of shame, fears of the future. We replay conversations in our heads. We clutch at outcomes we cannot shape. We carry burdens that were never ours to bear. And it isn't the world's weight that exhausts us. It's our refusal to lay it down. Letting go isn't passive. It's a conscious, courageous act. It requires seeing clearly what you're holding and asking yourself, is this serving my freedom or my suffering? Sometimes it means forgiving someone who will never apologize. Other times it means releasing an identity you've outgrown, or surrendering to the unknown, trusting the river's current more than your desire to control its course. And with every act of release, something remarkable happens. A space opens. A lightness returns. What once felt heavy becomes bearable, then beautiful. You begin to experience a different kind of love, not one rooted in possession or expectation, but in presence. A love that says, "I honor you as you are, even as you change, even as you leave." You start to witness your emotions, not as enemies to be suppressed or indulged, but as passing guests. Joy comes and you welcome it. Grief arrives and you offer it tea. Nothing stays forever, and that's no longer a threat. It's a kind of grace. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering, but letting go is the root of peace. And not just peace in grand, spiritual moments, but in the ordinary hours of your life. In the quiet acceptance when a plan falls apart. In the stillness when someone disappoints you and you choose release over resentment. In the breath you take before answering anger with anger and you decide to drop the rope. This is freedom. Not the absence of difficulty, but the absence of unnecessary struggle. It's the deep, unshakable knowing that whatever rises will fall, whatever comes will go. And in that cycle, you are both participant and witness. When you learn to let go, the world stops feeling like an opponent. It becomes a dance, a conversation, a teacher. And you finally become a student of its wisdom. You realize you don't need to dam the river. You only need to learn how to float. In the end, nothing belongs to us. Not our loved ones, not our youth, not our victories, nor our failures. Everything is on loan from life itself. And the most beautiful moments are the ones we meet fully, then release gracefully. This is the art of letting go, not as an act of loss, but as an invitation to inner freedom. And in this quiet, brave practice, you don't become detached from life. You become more intimately woven into its mystery. You stop chasing permanence and start discovering presence. You trade control for curiosity, fear for tenderness, grasping for gratitude, and in that sacred exchange, you come home to yourself. Not the self built of titles, possessions, or stories, but the self that watches it all. The self that was never bound. The self that is already free. There's a moment in every life. A moment when you realize the river was never meant to be fought. That all your plans, your worries, your grasping at outcomes were like trying to hold water in your hands. And no matter how tightly you clench your fists, it slips through. The wise ones knew this long before we did. The old Zen masters who sat in silence by mountain streams. The forest monks who listened to the wind moving through bamboo leaves. They understood what we keep forgetting. Life moves. And peace comes not by controlling its current, but by learning to move with it. To live in harmony with the flow is not to be passive. It's not surrendering your dreams or abandoning your heart. It's understanding the rhythm of existence and learning to dance with it. Like a surfer reading the ocean's pulse. Like a bird adjusting its wings to the wind. It's a way of moving through this world lightly, yet fully present. And it begins with listening. Listening to the quiet signals life offers us every day. The tightening in your chest when you say yes to something that feels wrong. The quiet joy in your belly when you follow a path you were afraid to choose. The gentle ending of things when you realize some seasons have run their course. Harmony isn't an external arrangement. It's an inner alignment. It's when your thoughts, your words, and your actions move together like a river with no jagged resistance between them. When you live this way, decisions stop feeling like battles. The heart knows. You begin to act not from impulse or fear, but from presence. And in presence, clarity arises. You see that there are moments to act and moments to wait. Times to hold on and times to release. Seasons to speak and seasons for silence. This wisdom isn't born from books. It's born from watching your own life and noticing where you create friction, where you swim upstream against reality, refusing what is, and where instead you might have let go and found yourself carried somewhere better than your mind imagined. To live in harmony with the flow is also to trust impermanence, to trust that endings are not punishments, that losses are not voids. That uncertainty isn't your enemy but your teacher. It's standing in the middle of a storm and instead of screaming at the sky, learning to dance in the rain. Because you understand now, the storm was never personal. It was just another movement in the great unfolding. There's a Japanese saying, The bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. We've been taught to be the oak, to stand rigid against life's tempests, to fight, to conquer, to win. But there's a quieter strength in bending, in yielding, in adapting, in allowing yourself to be changed by the journey without losing the truth of who you are. And the truth is, you were never meant to be fixed. Not your identity, not your plans, not your heart. You were meant to evolve, to shed skins, to fall apart and reassemble, to let some things die so others could be born. In the Taoist tradition, they speak of wu-wei, effortless action. Not inaction, but action so in tune with the flow that it feels natural, inevitable, like a leaf carried downstream. This isn't laziness, it's wisdom. It's knowing when to speak and when to be still, when to intervene and when to trust the unfolding, when to chase and when to wait, and perhaps most importantly, when to stop trying to make sense of it all and just live. To wake up in the morning and feel the sun on your face without needing a reason. To let sorrow visit without labeling it as failure. To let love arise without trying to capture or predict its future. This is what it means to live in harmony with the flow. Not because you've mastered the world, but because you've stopped demanding that it be mastered. And something beautiful happens in this surrender. You start noticing things you never did before. The way light moves across a room at dawn. The quiet kindness of strangers. The gentle wisdom of your own aging hands. You realize that you are a part of this vast, breathing tapestry, neither above it nor beneath it. Not separate from the river, but water itself. And life, in its infinite wisdom, begins to move through you, carrying you where you need to go, teaching you what you need to know, and offering you in every moment the sacred choice to resist, or to trust, to harden or to open, to fight the current or to flow. And in choosing to flow, you don't lose yourself, you find yourself, the self beyond the stories, the self that needs no titles, no victories, no permanence, the self that was always there, quiet, vast, and free. You become a living part of the great unfolding, not a victim of its tides, but a witness to its grace. And when you live like this, even in the midst of sorrow, there's peace. Even in uncertainty, there's wonder. Even in loss, there's beauty, because you've stopped clinging to what must leave. And you've learned the simplest, deepest truth: everything flows, and so can you. Long before words were written on paper, before books lined shelves and teachings were captured in ink, wisdom traveled through the world in the simplest, purest form: stories. Stories whispered by firelight. Stories carried by monks across mountains. Stories that moved from heart to heart, untouched by time. And in the Buddhist tradition, these stories, these ancient parables, hold something rare. They aren't meant to entertain. They aren't lessons wrapped in fear or threat. They're mirrors. Mirrors reflecting the deepest truths of our nature in ways our restless, clever minds can finally understand. Let me tell you one. There was once a man being chased by a hungry tiger. Running for his life, he came to the edge of a cliff. With no way to turn back, he grasped a vine and swung himself over the side. Below, jagged rocks waited like teeth. Above, the tiger prowled. Clinging to the vine, his arms trembling, he noticed two mice, one white, one black, nibbling at the vine's stem. And as his fate dangled between sky and earth, life and death, his eyes caught a single wild strawberry growing beside him. Bright red, perfect, and in that impossible moment, he reached out, plucked the strawberry and tasted it, and it was the sweetest thing he had ever known. You see, the tiger is death. The mice are time, night and day, wearing away the thread of our lives. And yet even here, even now, there are strawberries. Moments of beauty, of tenderness, of life itself, waiting to be noticed. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now. The old Zen masters knew this. They told stories like this not to frighten, but to wake us up, to remind us, You're not promised the next chapter, but you are here now, and there are strawberries. Another parable speaks of a man crossing a river on a raft. Once he reaches the other side, he thinks, "This raft helped me so much. I'll carry it on my back just in case." And so he does. But the raft, once a tool, becomes a burden. Weighed down, he struggles through forests and over hills, still clinging to what once served him. The Buddha asked, should he keep carrying it or lay it down? The answer is clear. And yet how often do we cling to old rafts? Old beliefs, old identities, old fears, things that once helped us survive but now keep us from moving forward. Stories like these slip past the walls of the intellect. They don't argue, they show. They bypass the endless debate of the mind and plant something deeper in the heart. A reminder that life is not meant to be carried as a burden, that the point is not to survive endlessly but to live deeply, to know when to hold on and when to let go. The Buddha himself spoke in stories. He told of the mustard seed. A grieving woman named Kisa Gautami lost her only child. Inconsolable, she carried the tiny body from house to house, begging for a cure. Finally, someone sent her to the Buddha. "Bring me a single mustard seed," he told her, "from a household untouched by death." Desperate, she knocked on every door in the village, and at every home she heard the same sorrow. A father lost, a child taken, a sister gone. By nightfall she understood that death is not a punishment, that grief is not personal. That impermanence touches all who live. She returned to the Buddha not with the mustard seed but with awakened eyes, and her suffering softened into wisdom. Stories like these are not relics, they're alive. Because every one of us is still chased by tigers. We still cling to old rafts. We still seek mustard seeds, believing our pain is unique. And yet the wisdom is always the same. Everything flows, everything passes. And within each moment, no matter how heavy, there's something bright, sweet, and alive. The Zen masters say, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Meaning the world doesn't change. The chores remain, the bills arrive, the losses come, but something in you softens. You stop fighting the river. You stop demanding permanence in an impermanent world. And in that letting go, you begin to notice the strawberries. You find beauty not because life is perfect, but because you finally stopped expecting it to be. That's the quiet miracle of these ancient stories. They don't offer escape. They offer clarity. They don't promise comfort. They promise truth. And truth, when held gently, becomes the softest kind of freedom. So listen for them. In the wind through the trees, in the hush before dawn, in the quiet voice inside that says, let go, it's time. Because life has always spoken in stories, and its greatest wisdom is still whispered, not shouted. You don't have to chase it. You only have to pause and listen. So much of what we suffer comes not from life itself, but from our resistance to it, our desperate clinging to the shore while the river of life keeps moving. But what if, instead of fighting the current, we could learn to float? Not by abandoning the world, but by meeting it with calm, steady eyes. This is where meditation comes in, not as an escape, not as a mystical ritual, but as a simple, honest way to remember how to be here, fully, uncomplicated, awake. And no, you don't need to shave your head, sit in a cave, or chant in a language you don't understand. Meditation is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming fully yourself without the noise. Let's begin. The breathing anchor. Right now, wherever you are, pause, notice your breath. Not the way you think it should be. Not some slow, dramatic, Instagram-worthy breath. Just this one, right here. Feel it enter. Feel it leave. This is your anchor. When the mind pulls you into stories, regrets, what-ifs, and imaginary futures, return here. To this inhale, to this exhale, because the breath is always honest. It never lies about where you are. The five senses grounding. When the storm inside grows loud, ground yourself through the senses. Notice 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. It sounds simple because it is. And it works. It brings you out of the imagined world and into this one, the only place you've ever truly lived. The impermanence reflection. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and bring to mind something you've been holding tightly. A worry, a fear, a memory. Now softly remind yourself, this too will pass. Everything you've ever loved, feared, or lost has changed. And so will this, not to numb you, but to free you. To let you taste in this small moment the freedom of non-attachment, walking meditation. Who says wisdom only arrives when you're sitting cross-legged? Go outside, walk slowly, with no destination, no phone, no hurry. With each step silently say, arriving. With the next, here. Arriving here, the earth beneath you, the sky above, the breath in your chest, and you not lost in thought but walking awake. The letting go practice. Before sleep, sit at the edge of your bed. Picture the day behind you, the conversations, the mistakes, the small victories, the things left undone. Then, with every slow exhale, imagine placing each one down, like stones from your pocket, one by one, until nothing is left but breath. Soft, steady, clean, and sleep will find you lighter. Loving kindness meditation. Close your eyes, picture someone you love. Whisper silently, may you be happy. May you be safe. May you live with ease. Now imagine someone neutral, then someone difficult. Offer them the same. And lastly, offer it to yourself. Because if your own heart remains tight and bitter, no philosophy, no teaching, no story will save you. Love is not a reward you earn when you've reached perfection. It's the fuel for the journey itself. The strawberry practice. Each day, find one moment, just one, to pause and notice a strawberry. A sunrise, a cup of tea, a quiet breath before the noise returns, and taste it fully. This isn't about chasing pleasure. It's about training your mind to see what's already here. You'll discover the sweetest moments often arrive quietly, while you were busy waiting for something else. These practices aren't about becoming a monk or transcending the world. They're about remembering the simple, radical truth: you're already here. And this moment, this exact one, is your life. Not the someday when things are better. Not the if only you planned, but this. Breathe, notice, let go, not because you should, but because there's a quieter, wiser part of you that's tired of struggling against the river and is ready to float. In every breath, there's an invitation to be awake, to be here, to be free. And with practice, you won't just understand impermanence. You'll live it, not as a burden, but as a kind of beautiful, fleeting miracle, a river you don't have to hold, because you were always meant to flow. And so we arrive here, not at an end, but at a quiet bend in the river, because there are no true endings. Only moments when the current slows just enough for us to look around, to notice where we are, to remember what matters. You see, this life, with all its tenderness, its loss, its unspeakable beauty, has never asked us to conquer it. It asks only that we move with it, to let it shape us, soften us, carry us. And the truth we so often forget is, we were never meant to hold on, not to people, not to moments, not even to who we think we are. Everything is a flow. The seasons turn, the tides shift. The faces around us age and disappear like mist. And within all this movement, there's a quiet freedom. For those willing to let go, not to drift aimlessly, but to flow consciously, choosing in every breath to release what we cannot keep, and to cherish what we can never truly possess. To love fully, knowing love will change. To grieve, knowing grief too is impermanent. To laugh like it's the first time, though it may be the last. This is what it means to live awake, not above the world, but tenderly, deeply, entirely within it. To greet each sunrise like a shy visitor you may not see again. To feel the warmth of a hand in yours without needing to claim it. To savor the brief sweetness of a moment like a ripe fruit on the tongue, knowing it will fade. And in its fading, discover the astonishing grace of impermanence. Because what if the fragility of life isn't a flaw, but the very thing that makes it precious? What if, in letting go of what you thought you needed, you find yourself holding everything that ever mattered, a quiet mind, a steady breath, an open heart? This is your practice, not in temples alone, but in city streets, in kitchen sinks, in the gentle ache of aging, in the soft light of evening. The river flows, and you are invited not to master it, but to move with it. To float, to dance, to live. If these words found a home in you, if something in this reminded you of a truth you've always known but perhaps forgotten, I'd like to gently invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not as a follower but as a fellow traveler, a heart walking beside hearts. Here we'll keep exploring quiet truths, ancient stories, simple practices for a complicated world. So when life feels heavy or the river turns dark, you'll have a place to return, a voice to remind you you were never meant to hold it all. You were meant to flow. Until then, breathe gently, let go, and live fully.